Hello and welcome to Tank and Amphi News. My name's Tom and today we are doing yet another review of 172 scale die-cast or pre-built models, because that's what I collect. And I got another batch yesterday from Russia, an eBay dealer in Russia. And these are all the Eaglemoss or Fabry, you've seen them under both names, line of pre-built or die-cast models. And they do make models of different countries, but all the ones I've bought are of Russian or Soviet vehicles, and the reason for that is because there's a lot of Russian or Soviet vehicles that they're the only ones that make a version of certain vehicles. And as far as their non-Russian stuff, those are mostly vehicles that I can find in other brands and are usually in better quality, because the Eaglemoss Fabry stuff is not particularly great quality, I would say, but they kind of compensate for that by being cheap. So we have 6 here today. The theme is sort of personnel carriers and amphibious stuff, with the exception of over here on this side we have the sort of pre-World War II era BA-6, and you might think, why is this one so big? Well, you got to be careful, because if you don't read the fine print you might accidentally order something that's actually in 143 scale, which was a scale I didn't even really know was out there, but you know, I was on the page for the vendor and adding stuff to the cart, and there are 172 scale versions of this out there, and I just sort of clicked on the wrong one. So I opened the package up yesterday and I was like, whoa, this thing's huge. So, well, I'll put it somewhere, but I'll separate it out for my 172 scale stuff, because I like to keep all my stuff that's one scale in one area. So, of course, the detail on this is, frankly, not a whole lot different than the detail quality on the 172 scale stuff. The wheels move and the turret turns, that's about it. No elevation on the gun. So it's not a particularly high quality, but, you know, for, I think it was 15 bucks or something like that, I don't even remember, plus shipping, it's not bad. So yeah, it almost looks more like a toy than a high quality model, to be honest, but it's kind of fun because it's such a weird vehicle. I mean, basically they just took the turret off the the turret was used on both the BT series tanks and the T-26 light tank, and threw it on an armored car chassis. Not a particularly successful vehicle. Obviously it lacked any decent off-road capability, and the armor protection was pretty light, but you know, one of those vehicles that saw you know, a bit of service in the sort of Operation Barbarossa period, the first 6 months of the war in the East in 1941. So I'll put it somewhere in my collection, but that is that. And again, always check the scale when you're ordering stuff, because that's the first time I've done that. You know, and I've got about almost 200 of these little 172 scale models, so I guess I was bound to screw up at some point. Next we have this little BTR-40. The BTR-40 was essentially the first Russian-produced armored personnel carrier right after World War II. And it is, you know, I've seen sources say that it is a copy of the M3 US Scout car, which we sent several thousand as Lend-Lease materials. Obviously, it's not a direct copy, but it's pretty similar in concept. Just a, you know, 4x4, essentially armored truck, open topped, and this was not considered a particularly successful vehicle for what the Red Army needed. Obviously, as a personnel carrier, it's not going to have the off-road capability to keep up with tracked vehicles in rough going. You know, it's open topped. It's got a lot of limitations, so, you know, they made a lot of them. You know, they're cheap. I assume they're probably fairly rugged, reliable vehicles. I don't know, but they were not terribly successful as an armed personnel carrier, just because if you need something that can survive in a battlefield where tanks are operating and can operate on that terrain at the same pace, then a wheeled vehicle is just going to be, at least a wheeled vehicle of that era is not going to be able to do it. So moving up, so instead of an APC, this next one is an IFV, Infantry Fighting Vehicle, the very first one, the BMP-1. So this one is, by Eaglemoss standards, pretty nice looking. The paint job's decent. It's not too shiny, so it doesn't seem like a toy so much. It looks more like a model. If anyone knows what the Blue Cross is, if it's specific to a certain operation or whatever, let me know. You know, these, unfortunately, these Fabry ones, they don't come with a lot of documentation. I think originally they came with a booklet, but a lot of these ones I buy on eBay that are cheap, like the booklet's no longer attached to them. And so this one, they really come with no explanation. There's a little bit of writing on the package, but it's in Russian, so it doesn't do me any good. So the blue, the blue cross on there, I assume it's for aerial recognition purposes, but I'm not sure the details. So BMP, interesting vehicle. The first infantry fighting vehicle caused quite a stir when it was introduced. It's one of those vehicles that probably scared the West more than it should have. This vehicle is problematic on a lot of levels. It's trying to do a lot of things all at once, and it ends up what you end up with is extremely lightly armored vehicle. Armament is impressive on paper, but not terribly effective. This low pressure 73mm gun is got pretty limited range, and armor penetration was decent, about the same as like an RPG-7, but accuracy and range are pretty weak. And then it's not depicted on the model, but you also had an AT-3 Sagger on the top there, which was very hard to aim and operate and to load for the gunner, which is a one-man turret. So you have driver on this hatch, if you can see the detail, commander there, and he's got a little infrared light, which actually, as you can see, interferes with the rotation of the turret and the gun. So that's something that really existed. The vehicle's so low as well that when the infantry are advancing, the firepower in this thing's actually, instead of going over their heads, can actually, it's low enough that it can actually hit them. So they had to sort of create special tactics to avoid getting hit by their own covering fire. And it is, as you can see, like the crew compartment's just this little back part of the vehicle, and there's not a lot of space back there. And this was a notoriously cramped vehicle. And I remember getting to see one of these, the real thing, the one-to-one scale version, in Nokesville, Virginia a few years ago, and just looking at these rear doors in the back and thinking to myself, oh my god, I don't think I could even like fit in there. Like they're so low, like having to crouch to get in and out of this thing would be tough. And these rear doors, which also doubled as fuel tanks. So very interesting vehicle, a vehicle that caused a big stir in the West, and the creation of a whole new class of vehicle, but a vehicle that was sort of flawed in a lot of ways when it came out, and which is why they came out with the BMP 2 and 3, and but Soviet Union, because of the scale, the sheer size of the Soviet army, they still maintained a large number of just traditional APCs as well. Next we have another infantry fighting vehicle, and certainly one of the smallest that was introduced, which is the BMD, which is sort of the, I don't want to call it a BMP version because it's a separate vehicle other than the turrets are the same, but this was intended for airborne troops, so it's like half the weight and a lot smaller, and this thing is tiny when you put it next to the BMP. I'm a little suspicious on the scale of this one, just because the turret size, I took the turrets off of both of these and compared them, and the turret on the BMD is slightly smaller, and as far as I know, the real vehicle sources say that it was the same turret. Why, since it's the same company, they wouldn't just use the same mold, I don't know, but I think the scale on one of these might be just a touch off. But I looked it up, this thing was incredibly small for an infantry fighting vehicle, or for just an armored vehicle in general. As far as the model quality, it's not bad. Turret rotates, that's about the only thing that really happens here. Like the BMP, it does not have the missile mounted above the cannon, so if you really need that level of detail, you're going to be disappointed. Paint job's decent, it's not too shiny, it doesn't look too toyish. So that is BMD. Next up, we're going to go back in time to the late 30s, beginning of World War II, and we have the T-28 light tank. And this one's really tiny. This was an amphibious light tank that was designed, and as you can see, it is a very small vehicle, very light. It was very lightly armored, very lightly armed, just a single machine gun and a turret. And if you look at the suspension, it's very reminiscent of sort of the tankettes of the period. Really not much to say about this vehicle. They produced a number of them, but they weren't terribly effective for obvious reasons. Other than it can swim, there's not much else it can do. It's a barely armored machine gun on tracks, essentially. And, the model quality is not bad. The detail on the machine gun, it's kind of hard to see, is poor. So one, at least though they do on the back here, contain the rudder and propeller for when it's in the water. It's nice that they got that detail in there at least. So overall, and nobody else makes this. Nobody else is probably going to make a pre-built 172 scale of this tank. This is not a particularly well-known or important tank of World War II, but it's fun to be able to add it to the collection of semi-useless light tanks. Really almost a tankette in terms of the size. Sticking with the theme of amphibious tanks, the last one we have here is the PT-76. This was a post-war design, and as you can see, it's much, much bigger than some of the others. It is, like amphibious tanks tend to be, it is rather boxy and large. And for those that are used to Soviet tanks being very small and streamlined, this one's a little different because it's, in height and shape, it's almost boxier than like the medium tanks of the period, but it is much, much lighter, more lightly armored, more lightly armed. 76 millimeter gun, which, by the time this thing's introduced is not a particularly impressive amount of firepower. And they made a lot of these tanks. They were exported. They were used all over the world. I don't know how particularly successful they are. If you're up against anybody who's got any sort of anti-tank capability, this is a very vulnerable vehicle. So other than the fact that it can swim, it's a big, poorly armed and armored target, essentially. But if the option is, because you're in an area that requires getting across water, a bad tank or no tank, then, well, I guess this is better than nothing. As far as the model itself, biggest complaint is the turret. I can't tell if it's a single piece that's part of the hull or if it's just so tight it does not turn at all, and I don't want to get too rough with it because it'll break. No elevation of the gun, so the detail on this one is, this one's pretty mediocre. Again, with a lot of these Fabry ones, the road wheels are not a separate piece, but you can see there's these little pieces in between, sort of holding them together, so that's always a knock against them, because obviously that's not on the actual vehicle. But as far as I know, I don't know if anybody else making a PT-76, so this is what's available. And again, it was like $12, so I'm not going to complain. Can add it to the collection. A really, it's one of those examples of the problems when you try to make a tank that floats. And these would be replaced, I think, sort of in the recon role by variants of the BMP later on. Because frankly, if you've got an infantry fighting vehicle that's amphibious, it's got about as much firepower and capability as these light tanks, so it kind of makes them irrelevant. But still an interesting vehicle from a historical standpoint. So that's our latest add to our collection. And probably the last sort of big group I'm going to be ordering. I've sort of picked up most of the Eaglemoss stuff I want. Future orders are probably going to be smaller numbers of more expensive examples from other companies, as there's some stuff out there. So right now in order, I have a British Tortoise, which is obviously a pretty unusual vehicle, and a I think an IS-7 on order, hopefully. I'm not sure though. Some of my orders have gotten canceled due to coronavirus and shipping not being available, so I'll have to wait and see. It sort of gets tricky when you're ordering stuff from China and or Russia. So anyhow, as I get that stuff, I will post reviews on it for those that are interested in getting into the fun and fantastic world of 172 scale military vehicle collecting. Alright, thank you much, and we'll catch you on the next one.